Order, please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, over the 2 days that we've now been fully aware of the FOIPOP breach, one thing has been clear. The messaging from this government has been to talk first and fact-check later. With regards to the breach, the Premier said on Wednesday, and I quote, "We felt there was technical issues on the site, which we brought it down and immediately contacted law enforcement." Immediately contacted law enforcement. By the government's own timeline, Mr. Speaker, the site was taken down on April 5th at 8:15 a.m. The police were notified on April 7th at 9 p.m. Did the Premier choose these words because immediately sounds more decisive than 60 hours later and after a conversation with her lawyer?
The Honourable Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've identified that by one of our own employees that there was a breach into the site, Mr. Speaker. The minister and her department went through that site to ensure where there's an actual breach outside of government. We discovered there was a breach outside of government. When we identified that breach had happened outside of government, the police were called.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Over 60 hours later. Yesterday, the Premier was asked about an inconsistency in what police may or may not have told the province regarding disclosing this breach to the public. He said, and I quote, "Our security team was talking to the Halifax Police Department. I don't know what the conversation was about, but through those conversations, that was how they ended up with the advice, I guess. The advice he was referring to was to stay silent." The Premier claims to not know what the conversation was about, but knows that it was about the advice to stay silent. How is the Premier able to simultaneously know and not know about the content of a meeting?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it comes as a surprise to the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, but there were conversations between our security team of the department with Halifax Regional Police. It is a common practice, Mr. Speaker, when someone reports a crime to the police, that the police come in communication with the people who reported the crime. They've continued over that period of time, back and forth in conversations. As I said on the very first day, that they at no time told us not to report that information. What we said back and forth in that conversation, the more time that they could have access to execute the law, Mr. Speaker, to ensure they got a hold of that hard drive, would ensure that would be no damage done to that, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, the House Leader of the Opposition Party is asking about the Chief of Staff. At no time did my Chief of Staff be involved in this. The Minister responsible for this file, Mr. Speaker, I have tremendous confidence in. And if the Minister wants to undermine the confidence of this member and this Minister, stand on his feet. And stand on his feet and accuse her, Mr. Speaker. But I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I have all the confidence in this Minister, her department, and we've got to the bottom of this.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
The Premier said here yesterday, "We know our portal was breached once." The department has since come forward and said they don't know if there are more breaches because they haven't completed their review on the logs. And again, the Premier states empathetically things that are later determined to be inaccurate or at least not representative of the full facts. Mr. Speaker, I believe the Premier is desperate to make this go away. When will the Premier realize that he needs to stop compounding his mistakes and tell the people that there was a vulnerability in the system for more than a year and that he doesn't know how many breaches there actually were and how much more information might be out there?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to assure the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, we know there was a breach, Mr. Speaker. It's why we took the time to call the Halifax Regional Police, Mr. Speaker, to go and execute the legal parts of the law to ensure that we got a hold of that hard drive to find out where that information has gone, whether it has left the hard drive and gone anywhere else, and we will know whether or not that information has been sent to other individuals or groups of individuals, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to make sure not only do we follow the law in this province, but we continue to move this province forward. We're seeing young unemployment dropping, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing more young people stay in this province, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing our exports grow. We're seeing pre-primary being delivered across our province, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
And we're going to continue to move this province forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last week a group of 40 organizations and businesses, including the Anglican Diocese of Nova Scotia and PEI, wrote the Premier urging the continuation of the fracking ban in Nova Scotia. The context for this is the deep uncertainty the government has created by its failure to proclaim the legislated fracking ban. Mr. Speaker, Ron Cutler, the Anglican Archbishop, knows that a commitment is not a 99% deal. A commitment is a 100% deal, and a 100% deal on a fracking moratorium would be a fracking moratorium that is proclaimed. Will the Premier show himself to be a person of 100% commitments and proclaim the fracking ban?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, there is a ban on fracking in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, this commitment has the character of a non-commitment commitment, and this non-commitment commitment is precisely what has led the Anglican Church to join 39 other organizations, including the Tattamagush Centre, the Nova Scotia Health Coalition, the Environmental Health Association, and the Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiative, Kairos, in expressing this concern. And the root of the concern is very simple. People do not have trust in a commitment from a government that fails to enact that commitment. Mr. Speaker, if the government's word about the fracking ban is a word that people can trust, why doesn't the Premier demonstrate this by proclaiming the moratorium legislation?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, in 2013, we laid out a very strong plan for the province, Mr. Speaker. We kept every one of those commitments to continue to move the province forward. We're now, Mr. Speaker, in 2017, we've seen, Mr. Speaker, we laid out a plan of commitments to this province, and we're continuing to move down that road to ensure the young people see a future for themselves in this province. Pre-primary opportunities, regardless of the socioeconomic circumstance you're born into. Every 4-year-old is going to get a play-based, beginning in their play-based educational start in this province, Mr. Speaker. We see now new hope. Our exports are on the rise, and we're going to continue to go, Mr. Speaker. Every commitment we've made to the people of Nova Scotia, we've kept.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Nothing in the Premier's response, Mr. Speaker, addresses the concern about the non-commitment commitment that has been put forward in this letter. It's totally reasonable that the Anglican Church and the other signatories, out of a deep worry about the dependability of the government's position, that they have joined together to call for an end to all further investigation of the potential development of shale gas and coal-bed methane in the province. I'll table their letter. Mr. Speaker, we had a ban on tire burning for fuel in Nova Scotia, and now Lafarge, under this government, has an approval for burning tires. So I want to ask the Premier, will he look the people of Nova Scotia in the eye and give his word that his government will proclaim the fracking ban?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank all those hardworking Nova Scotians who work with our government, continue to keep our commitments, Mr. Speaker, as we continue to grow this province and move the province forward. We had quite a hole to dig out of, Mr. Speaker, but we finally seen the light, Mr. Speaker, on moving this province forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Internal Services. On Tuesday in question period, the Minister of Internal Services said to my colleague from Argyll Barrington, and I quote, "I'd like to assure the member that safeguarding the public's privacy is of utmost importance." She said that here, on this floor, in this House, knowing that 7,000 non-public documents were in the wind. She said the public's privacy is of utmost importance, while 250 documents she knew contained highly sensitive information were not secure. She said this knowing that it wasn't an elaborate hack that exposed this information, but simply her department's failure to properly secure it. Can the minister please reconcile her words with her actions?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we followed the protocol. Police made an arrest, and we believe our actions were appropriate. Right now, our focus is on contacting those individuals who have been directly impacted by this incident.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the protocol says that public notification can be delayed if the government is counseled to do so only by law enforcement. The minister claims that Halifax Regional Police asked her to delay, but the police and her own deputy minister say that the conversation didn't happen. We all saw that. It's on TV. In one scrum, she clearly says she was asked. In another, she says she wasn't. The minister failed to protect personal information. This crime was not sophisticated. The police solved it over the weekend. But this minister doesn't tell anyone until she can point to a kid and say it's his fault, not ours. Will the minister admit that the charges laid in this case are less about punishing an offender and more about protecting her government?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we identified a breach. Police were able to make an arrest within less than a week. That is proof that our protocols work. Right now, Mr. Speaker, our focus is on contacting those individuals who have been impacted by this incident.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. I'd like to direct my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the R.K. Macdonald Nursing Home in Antigonish announced that it's reducing staffing hours in all support service departments because of a funding shortfall of $500,000. The result will be that instead of a ratio of 1 CCA to 5 or 6 residents, the ratio now is going to be 1 for 6 or 7. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, on behalf of the 136 residents of the RK, does he understand that the current provincial funding level for nursing homes is not enough to provide the care that's needed?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he knows, Mr. Speaker, in the budget that was passed last September, October, there was a reinvestment back into long-term care. As he would know, the specific question that he raised about this particular nursing home, Mr. Speaker, I don't know the details of it, but I promise the Honourable Member I will look into it.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. In the statement that the RK issued yesterday, the very point the Premier made is addressed. They said that although they received added targeted funding for food and recreation in the 27-18 budget, this does not for them alleviate the operational and salary pressures that come from the cuts that the government had made over the 2 straight years before that. In order for them to deal with those pressures, the Home says that now they have to announce they've got no choice but to reduce staffing hours and to combine a number of staff positions. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier acknowledge that it's the cutback decisions of this government that are squarely responsible for the reduction in care hours at the R.K. Macdonald Home?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my first response, I didn't see the details of the announcement yesterday. I certainly will follow up from the question from the Honourable Member. It's my understanding, though, Mr. Speaker, through the department, that the changes are not related to nursing staff or directly patient contact, Mr. Speaker, but I will, as I said early on, do a follow-up and get back to the Honourable Member.
Just before we move on to the next question, I want to remind the Honourable Member that it's not proper to ask questions, quote unquote, on behalf of individuals or constituents or groups, so just a wording thing. The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, this government continues to frame the FOIPOP incident as some kind of caper, where they outsmarted an Edward Snowden-type intent on taking the province hostage. And what Nova Scotians are actually worried about, Mr. Speaker, is they're worried about the weak security framework around critical government programs. If the minister wants to be as forthcoming as she claims to be, she should not be calling it a breach. This is a leak. And this leak was out in the open for anyone to find for over a year. My question to the Minister of Internal Services: why does the minister continue to evade questions about the weak institutional procedures that led to this leak of thousands of documents?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the FOIPOP portal is a unique system that's separate from any others. We are working closely with the vendor and to have a comprehensive review of the vulnerability and to assess the proper steps that we need to take to mitigate any further safeguards.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the minister spoke at length of how she would be constantly rethinking security measures at internal services. She spoke of more investments in cybersecurity. That's not the problem here, Mr. Speaker, and the minister still doesn't get that. This was a clear failure in quality assurance and testing. That's basic stuff. The only people disputing the simple facts are across from us here in the House. The department didn't do its job for a number of years and was underlined by the Attorney General, the AG, the Auditor General last year. And now the minister is saying that we should be thankful for this gross negligence. Mr. Speaker, will the minister finally take responsibility for the unacceptable procedures in her department that led to this crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People need to be assured that our systems are safe. So in this particular case, we followed protocols, an arrest was made, and we feel that it came to a successful outcome. But Mr. Speaker, I would like to reiterate that right now, our focus is on contacting those individuals who have been directly impacted by this incident.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we're asking basic, important questions of this government about basic security protocols. These same questions are being asked by the media, they're being asked by concerned Nova Scotians, and the talking points from the government say nothing about the basic way these documents were obtained. They say nothing about the fluke discovery of the vulnerability, not by a QA tester, Mr. Speaker, but by a researcher doing non-technical work. They say nothing of why all these documents were sitting in plain sight for years in the first place. And that's not good enough for anyone who has shared personally identifiable information with government. Will the minister admit that someone in internal services will need to be held publicly accountable for this severe breach in trust?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we followed protocols. We were able to identify, police were able to make an arrest, and we believe that our actions were appropriate. Right now, Mr. Speaker, our focus is on contacting those individuals who are directly impacted by this incident.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Read the talking points, repeat. Read the talking points, repeat. The Premier and the Minister continue to characterize the breach as a malicious actor picking a lock. And they say the burglar was tracked down, thanks in part to the Minister's quick actions. But there was no lock to pick, Mr. Speaker. Any Nova Scotian with internet access, which is not everybody, and a rudimentary understanding of how web pages are indexed could have done the exact same thing. Some may have done it without even knowing, Mr. Speaker, and wouldn't have registered as a significant on access to logs. If it took virtually nothing for the Freedom of Information site to be compromised, what does it say about this government's preparedness for a sophisticated effort to misuse digital assets?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, people need to be assured that our systems are safe, which is why we follow strict protocols and why we look constantly to investigate and to safeguard. Right now, our focus is on contacting those individuals who have been impacted by this breach.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Perhaps the focus should be on ensuring a safe site. Citizens accept that they must share some of their most intimate information with their government. But the unspoken contract between citizens and their government is that the government will guard that information and protect the privacy of its citizens. When that contract is broken, Mr. Speaker, and when private information is made public, citizens feel betrayed and their trust in their government is broken. And again, it wasn't an elaborate hack that exposed this information by simply a department's failure to properly secure it. Does the minister agree that when governments make private information public and when the public trust is broken, ministers must be accountable?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are following protocols that are designed to keep our systems straight, to secure and safe. Right now, our focus is on contacting those individuals who have been impacted by this incident.
Good job. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the concept of ministerial responsibility is one that most democracies take very seriously. That's why in 2011, when he revealed private information about a Fredericton area woman, New Brunswick Minister of Justice Bernard LeBlanc resigned and did the right thing. That's why in January, after a security breach that may have led to the large-scale disclosure of citizens' sensitive personal information, 2 senior Swedish ministers resigned, Mr. Speaker. The minister chose to protect her government rather than Nova Scotians. The police confirmed that. Will she resign today?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I serve at the pleasure of the Premier. Right now, my focus is on contacting those individuals who have been impacted by this breach.
Good job. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. In preparation for the legalization of cannabis, the government has introduced amendments to the Smoke-Free Places Act. One amendment is to change the definition of smoke to include the use of a vaporizer, defined as a device that burns or heats any substance intended to be smoked or inhaled. Users of medical cannabis, Mr. Speaker, which will continue to be federally regulated, are concerned that they will not have a safe space to consume cannabis for symptom relief. Mr. Speaker, has the minister considered providing an exemption for individuals using vaporized medical cannabis with a federally approved medical device?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the work undertaken in this particular matter and the consultation that took place around safe spaces and secondhand smoke, we actually expanded, Mr. Speaker, the Smoke-Free Places Act to put restrictions in place, Mr. Speaker, to enhance public safety. But to the point of my colleague's question, there remains what we believe to be reasonable spaces for those who choose to consume recreational cannabis, as well as those, Mr. Speaker, who have the legal authority to consume medicinal marijuana.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, those aren't the concerns we've been hearing. The changes that have been proposed by the government allow landlords to distinguish between smoking tobacco and smoking cannabis. However, the use of medical cannabis within the definition of smoke has raised the concern that landlords will be able to restrict the ability of individuals to use medical cannabis in rented properties. Mr. Speaker, individuals with disabilities are often already limited in their available housing options. We don't want to create additional unnecessary barriers. What reassurance can the minister provide that medical users of cannabis will not lose their rights when recreational cannabis becomes legal?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question, because it is important to differentiate between the medicinal stream regulated by Health Canada and the recreational consumption captured in the bill we've introduced. Mr. Speaker, the Smoke-Free Places Act provides for that latitude. The expansion of the Smoke-Free Places Act that we have addressed, Mr. Speaker, is intended to enhance public safety, particularly around our youth, and I'm confident, Mr. Speaker, that there are those opportunities for those who have legal permission to consume medicinal marijuana remains in place in our communities.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the growing number of people without access to guaranteed palliative care services is not something that is unique to one area of the province. This, Mr. Speaker, is the reality at the Straight Richmond Hospital in Cape Breton-Richmond. Earlier this week, I shared in this House Danny and Linda Latimer's heartbreaking circumstances. I am saddened to announce that Danny's battle with cancer has ended, Mr. Speaker. Danny Latimer died yesterday morning. In the last week of his life, Linda Latimer found the courage to speak up about the injustice and the indignity of their experience in the final days of Danny's life. I would encourage others to follow her example. The last year, at least 7 palliative patients and their families were forced the indignancy of spending their last days with their loved ones in the busy ER at the Strait Richmond Hospital. 7. I would like to ask the Minister if he believes it is acceptable to have palliative care patients spending the last days of their life in the busy ER at the Strait Richmond Hospital.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for bringing this topic forward today. Of course, Mr. Speaker, circumstances like those that were brought forward last week are a concern for all Nova Scotians, but would want to assure the member opposite and all Nova Scotians as they move, especially if they have a loved one towards the end of life requiring palliative care services, that we continue to expand these services, Mr. Speaker. The NSHA is working to ensure that there's standardization in terms of the approach to providing palliative care services in our hospitals across the province, but also recognizing that there are other locations where people choose to make these services available, including in their own homes, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we have programs that have physicians and nurses and even paramedics, Mr. Speaker, to support the families in their own home going through these services.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton, Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, in the fall session, I asked a question to the Minister regarding 2 years' worth of unanswered correspondence from the Strait Richmond Palliative Care Society. 2 years. Letters to the NSHA, the Deputy Minister, the Minister, and even the Premier. I will table those letters, Mr. Speaker. In this correspondence is also included the Strait Area and Richmond Palliative Care Program proposal dated October 2015. I will table that document as well, Mr. Speaker. It is a collaborative approach from the Strait Richmond Area Community Health Board and the Strait Richmond Palliative Care. The Premier has agreed earlier this week that the circumstances of palliative care patients dying in ERs and hallways and storage closets is unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, could the Minister then explain why 2 years' worth of correspondence and a plan of action for palliative care services submitted in October 2015 have had no action and have gone unanswered?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to advise the member opposite that, in fact, there was a lot of action taking place under the leadership of the former Minister of Health and Wellness, the current Minister of Community Culture and Heritage. Mr. Speaker, during that time period, the Minister of the Department of Health and Wellness brought forward a proposal to establish a framework for hospice care in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That has come forward. So now there's a framework in place so that when communities come forward, Mr. Speaker, looking for this type of service, we have a framework that the staff can work with them to establish these programs in their communities.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Asking questions about the Valley Hospice has been a constant in my political career. I think I've asked the question every session since 2013. And with the great fanfare of last summer's hospice announcement billed in Kentville, I thought that I was done asking those questions, but sadly not. Valley residents are concerned that the hospice has not yet put a spade in the ground, although they were promised that the build would begin this spring. Can the Minister tell me if a spade will get in the ground this spring as promised on the hospice build?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for again bringing the attention about this hospice program. That's a part of the work that I'd mentioned in the previous question, in response to the previous question, that indeed there's work ongoing throughout the province in regard to providing hospice services, and that work was ongoing during the time period the previous member was referring to. Again, the work in Valley Hospice in Kentville, Mr. Speaker, is ongoing. A lot of work has been done to date, and that project's going to be operating as quickly as possible. The member would refer to the budget. We have the capital money in there, Mr. Speaker, to have the work begin this year.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that answer from the Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Valley Hospice hasn't yet gone out to tender, yet the Halifax Hospice was announced to be up and running in 2018. Kings County has had their money raised for over 5 years, yet Halifax has not done their fundraising yet. The people of Kings County have been doing their work and they're waiting for government to meet them. My question for the Minister is this: why has the government been so willing to move forward on the Halifax Hospice, yet move so slowly on the Valley Hospice project?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, as the member has indicated, he's quite aware and quite engaged on the topic of the Valley Hospice. Mr. Speaker, recognizing that, I'm sure the member's aware that this particular project has gone through a few different design iterations. Certainly, you want to make sure in the planning process you get the right design in place to ensure that the proper services are being provided, with also the best value for that design that's being provided. So while there were some delays at the front end of this work, Mr. Speaker, I believe that's going to be in the best interest of all those people in the community who are going to be making use of this facility on a go-forward basis. And I'd like to recognize and thank the many people in the community who have contributed to this initiative, both campaigning for it and contributing financially.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. This week, CBC reported that Business Cape Breton had recently been dissolved. 4 employees have been issued layoff slips and landlords been given notice. The switch to a REN for Economic Development Agency was driven by the province and not the CBRM municipality. My question for the government is, why is the government trying to fix what isn't broken, and what is REN going to do for Cape Breton that Business Cape Breton wasn't doing?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Essentially, the REN program is the program that municipalities utilize to receive funds from the Department of Municipal Affairs. It's a very transparent way for us to distribute money to municipalities. They work with the private sector. They work with community organizations to stimulate economic development. I've indicated to the CBRM almost a year ago that this was the path forward for them, that we would sit down with them and look at the economic tools that they have at their disposal. The REN is that model to do that. That is the most transparent way for us to report to Nova Scotians how money is being spent in economic development, and we're more than willing to sit down with the CBRM to work through that process to get it done.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Minister. My question continues. So, is that Business Cape Breton recently received $400,000 in funding last year in the fiscal year. On the website, the agency has claimed that it helped over 134 clients in new business development between April 2013 and April 2017, with a projected job potential of over 292 people. I'd table that. It seems ending a long-standing economic development organization in favor of a newer model with an unproven history so far in this province does not necessarily look like progress. So my question to the minister is, when will CBRM have a new REN up and running to replace Business Cape Breton, and what are the targets that are being set for that REN?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll say this too, I've had the opportunity to work with many of the economic development agencies, including Business Cape Breton. In my time as a councillor and an MLA, they're a great organization, but we deal directly with municipalities. The REN is the most transparent way for us to distribute funds to municipal units to support economic development in their communities. I indicated this to the mayor of the CBRM almost a year ago, that this was the process to move forward to make sure the money that we expend is transparent and accountable to Nova Scotians. We are going through that process. Staff has met with the CBRM. We're trying to move as quickly as we can, and we are taking everything into consideration to ensure that the CBRM and other municipal units across the province receive all the benefits of the REN, and that we can design them in a way that best suits the needs and the strengths of communities across the province.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Trade. The Digby Ferry has been shut down for 3 months now. Trucker Brian Reynolds said it is the longest closure he can remember, and I'll table that. And it means trucks are spending an extra 14 hours on the road going around through Truro and the top Cobequid Pass and then coming back. That's impacting drivers, and it's hurting seafood exports. So I think people in those industries would like to know, given the importance of our fishery exports, how is this government working with Transport Canada and Bay Ferries to make sure the delays don't continue?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, we've had a tremendous growth in trade here in the province with some of the looming trade agreements that we have. Nationally, internationally, Mr. Speaker, we know that trend will continue, led by fisheries, the Minister of Fisheries, and the great people that are in all of our communities driving fisheries growth and export. With respect to the individuals, the member's question, we'd be happy to talk to Transport Canada, Mr. Reynolds, and Bay Ferries about these issues that the member certainly believes to be pressing. I haven't heard any specific details on that, so if the member wants to line up a conversation, I'd be happy to participate. Thanks.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, this project, this interruption to a crucial ferry link was supposed to be finished by early March. Then it was late March. Now it's looking like it's going to be late April. The repairs are delayed in part because Transport Canada didn't gather all the materials before it started. The work could have happened in October when there was less demand for the ferry for transporting seafood products. And it all makes me wonder if perhaps the Premier should have taken one less trip to China and maybe one more to Digby. So my question for the Minister is, given that we knew repairs would be necessary, what did the province do to make sure that the impacts on fishery exports would be minimized?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unlike the Honourable Member and her party, Mr. Speaker, we believe we have world-class seafood and agri-products in this province. Mr. Speaker, we've continued to look for new markets to ensure that we get the right price, Mr. Speaker. We've seen lobster stay, Mr. Speaker, at historic highs in rural communities. That money is spinning around on deckhands, Mr. Speaker, car dealerships. But if the if the honourable member would do her research, Mr. Speaker, the issue is actually in New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. The national government and the province of New Brunswick are working on the terminal in New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. The infrastructure in Nova Scotia is safe and ready to use.
The honourable member for Inverness.
I recently asked a question of the Minister responsible for human rights about organizations who could not sign the Trudeau government's attestation policy for student jobs because they believe an unborn person is a child. When I raised the issue in the House, the Minister agreed with the federal government. He stated that the individuals who are being paid under taxpayer dollars must not do any work that goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Mr. Speaker, the Charter doesn't say anything about reproductive rights. And in fact, the Chesterco Museum and Historical Society in Port Hood stated that it does, however, include the protection of the fundamental freedoms of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. They went on to say, denying our application on the basis we hold a view that differs from that of the current federal government is a violation of our charter rights. So, Mr. Speaker, it appears that the Chesterco Museum Society knows the Charter of Rights better than the Minister. Can the Minister explain which part of the Charter of Rights the Chesterco Museum is going against?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question that my colleague has posed, I believe directed to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, is a federal matter. Mr. Speaker, for the information of the House, the Minister of Justice has responsibility for the human rights portfolio, and I can't speak, Mr. Speaker, to the policies and strategies of the federal government.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll direct this question to the Premier. If there is anyone in this chamber we must count on to see the truth, it is the Premier. These organizations are not breaking any laws, yet they're being denied government benefits because of what they believe. 200 years ago, in chambers like this, there were penal laws that we got rid of because they were seen as archaic, and that was 200 years ago. How is this required attestation any different than a penal law? Will the Premier find a few $1,000s to fund student employment for the organizations who've had the courage to stand up for what they believe?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was going to tell the honourable member to encourage every organization to apply to the student programs here in the province. We'll be happy to work with them to ensure. We'll be happy to work with them to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the optimistic young Nova Scotians that are applying for jobs and those that come here to go to work continue to see a bright future for themselves in our province, and we'll use the precious public dollars that we have, that we continue to do, to provide them co-op placements, summer job placements, or actually work with employers to find them permanent work here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of TIR. Mr. Speaker, recently we've heard much about the bridge in in Myra Gut, and I know the minister is working on a solution there, and part of the solution involves a 20-plus kilometre detour that's taking place. One of the roads, and I thank the minister for that, the Horns Road is being redone this year, but the other part is the Brickyard Road, which leads to one of our finest parks in Nova Scotia at the Myra River Park. The road is very poor, so my question to the minister is, would he consider adding that road to his list so that when he comes in May, we'll be able to take him on a good road?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. We are well down the road and determining what the solution is for the Myra Gut Bridge. We actually determined that we need a little over 6-metre clearance there based on the study that has been done, and of course that elevates the arc of the bridge and does add to the cost. We don't have a full appreciation yet for what that is going to be. What the member brings forward will be part of the analysis that we do when we get to the point as to whether or not that bridge will be replaced or not. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Oh, thank you very much for that answer. I'm not sure I'm happy, but I thank you for the answer. There is a burning question, Mr. Speaker, that I have to ask the minister as we seem to be getting into the dying days of this session. And last year, on the new Boston Road, Mr. Speaker, we actually got a portion of pavement. And I thank the minister for that and the former minister as well. My request, Mr. Speaker, is can we get the same amount again this year?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and at the member's invitation, I look forward to touring the new Boston Road later on this spring, and we'll just see where we're at when we look at the overall picture for that area. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. As I've said in the past, the new Island View High School in Eastern Passage was deliberately built with the knowledge that the students there would not have access to the IB or Skills Trades program. Last week, 16 students from Island View High School signed up to take a grade 10 one class called Skills Trade 10 to give them the prerequisite to apply for out of area transfer to Cole Harbour High for grade 11 and 12. At the time that they did that, they applied to the Department of Education for that one class, and the Department of Education said no to that one class. Will the Minister of Education reverse this decision and give the students from Shearwater, Cow Bay and Eastern Passage a fighting chance to secure the future that they deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we want all of our students to succeed in this province in every one of our schools. That's why we've made the important investments we've made. That's why we've made the difficult decisions to change our administrative structure, our governance structure. So at the end of the day, each of those students in all of our schools are getting exactly what they need from our education system. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister knows, I spoke to him about this on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, and on Thursday. And I'm also aware that when the education bill was brought forward, that the minister stated that the goal was to give more authority and autonomy at the local level, and specifically to the high school principals. The request of 16 students was for one class. The high school isn't even finished being built yet. I would maintain that the time to consider building capacity for the skills trades program would be now, before the construction is completed. So I'm wondering if the minister will consider meeting with the principal of the high school to discuss this issue, and if the department has any intention of allowing the grade 10 skills trade program to ever be offered at the school, would he not concede that now would be the time to do so?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll take the member's comments under advisement.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. The Canada Child Benefit is an important program for reducing child and family poverty. When children are removed from a home by Child Protective Services, the benefit goes with them. And when children are returned to the home, it often takes months before the benefit is restored. When I asked the Minister about this in estimates, she indicated she was not aware of the issue. However, we have heard from many cases where frontline child protection social workers say that this has happened. Mr. Speaker, is the Minister concerned about this breakdown of communication between her office and the front lines?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure her that we want the best outcomes for the children who come into our care, even if it's briefly, Mr. Speaker. And at that time, I committed to her that we would be meeting with our social workers as well as our federal partners to make sure that that does not happen. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please thank the Minister for her encouraging response. But there is a simple fix here that would make a significant difference to families who are in a very vulnerable stage of reunification. The Department already has a system for providing individuals with maintenance enforcement payments up front and then recovering those funds from the payer. You would think that when the groups involved are two levels of government that we could have already figured this out. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister commit to developing an agreement with the federal government to ensure families involved with Child Protection Services do not go for months without the Canada Child Benefit amounts they're entitled to?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
As I've already communicated to the honourable member, we're happily working on this particular issue, and I thank her for bringing it forward.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the collaborative emergency centres in Spring Hill, Parsbro, and Pugwash, all three of them were closed, Mr. Speaker. This leaves the citizens in these communities without close access to urgent care, some of them having to drive over 80 minutes in times of emergency to the regional hospital. This regional hospital was not designed to serve 34,000 people. Dr. Brian Ferguson of Amherst said this week, we can't be a regional hospital for 34,000 people with only 11 emergency beds, and I'll table this document. Question to the Minister of Health is, will he look at increasing the number of emergency beds and increase physician staffing resources to handle the increased patient load at the regional hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. First, I want to assure the member and all Nova Scotians that Nova Scotians do not go without emergency care, Mr. Speaker. We have a top-notch emergency system in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and in a healthcare emergency, Mr. Speaker, encourage them to call 911. With respect to the services and the availability in our hospitals, Mr. Speaker, ongoing work with our partners, the Nova Scotia Health Authority, for emergency rooms and all aspects of our healthcare system. We're always looking for opportunities to improve those services, and we'll continue that work.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I will respectfully disagree with this response that we have a top-notch emergency services in this province. You ask the people of Nova Scotia, we do not. There are deficiencies all across this province. We have a problem, Mr. Speaker, in this province with physicians leaving. This month, we learned again, we have an internal medicine physician leaving in Amherst, family doc leaving in Spring Hill. When I asked them why, you know what they said? They said, we're leaving to BC to make less money because we're not respected in this province. They said there is an anti-physician culture. I had someone tell me in the Nova Scotia Health Authority that physicians are the problem. When will the Minister of Health take charge of the Nova Scotia Health Authority Board and CEO and take responsibility for this ineffective leadership of the Nova Scotia Health Authority?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for highlighting the fact that Nova Scotia indeed doesn't have the lowest paid physicians in the country. Based upon the information she just brought to the floor, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work with Doctors Nova Scotia and our other partners in the healthcare system to provide the services, to increase access to primary care. We know that there needs to be more work to be done, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we announced almost $40 million going towards physician compensation, Mr. Speaker, to encourage them to provide primary care, to be there for Nova Scotians. We know there's more work to be done, and that's why we're continuing to work with our partners, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we hear news of more and more closures of emergency rooms in Cape Breton. More and more services lost, more and more doctors leaving. But we hear in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, that over 100 doctors have come, but not once have we heard how many doctors have left. Mr. Speaker, people are getting very frustrated with the healthcare system in Cape Breton and the lack of input from this government. Mr. Speaker, the lack of answers from this health minister are making people more and more frustrated, to the point where they're going to march in the streets on April the 28th in North Sydney. Mr. Speaker, I asked the minister, please answer my question. I don't want an expensive preamble, how great everything is, how much you're doing. Please answer the question. Will you attend that rally, set the people's mind at ease in North Sydney that healthcare will be coming back to North Sydney, to Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member had asked about the net flow of physicians, Mr. Speaker, in the province. And, Mr. Speaker, that net flow for the minister.
Order, please.
It's a simple question.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Health.
If, Mr. Speaker, if the member would look at the Kai reports, Mr. Speaker, it shows very clearly what the net results were, Mr. Speaker, for physician flow into the province.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount will come to order. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.